Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser, and with me, as ever, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist, Ella Whelan.
Hi.
There's only one thing to talk about this week, and that is the fall of Boris Johnson. So, Prime Minister Boris Johnson finally resigned on Thursday after more than 50 ministers quit his government in a 48-hour period. The beginning of the end was triggered by the Chris Pincher scandal, his wandering hands. Johnson tried to claim he had no knowledge of Pincher's reputation. This lie was quickly exposed, and then the rest is history. Tom, when Boris Johnson first came to power, or certainly when he won the 2019 general election with this overwhelming mandate, there was a sense that he was unimpeachable, that he was going to be around for decades, for several terms, he was going to transform the country. And yet he's leaving after just 3 years, roughly the same kind of time as Theresa May had. What do you think that means? What do you think that tells us?
So much, and I'm sure we'll get into it over the course of this whole episode. I suppose ultimately the Boris Project has failed, given the fact that he's left Downing Street. And there's all kinds of different reasons for that. I think it's important to remember just how important that election was, how seismic it was in securing Brexit, but also really sending a message to the establishment, which has spent the previous few years trying to overturn the vote for Brexit, trying to kind of reassert its authority after the Brexit vote, to say who's in charge, essentially. All of that was really important. And it really felt like there was a change in the air, Boris Johnson really rode that popular sentiment all the way to number 10 to a very strong majority. And there was talk even at the time of deepening this. The Tories were talking in their manifesto about reviewing the role of the House of Lords and judicial review and all these different things. They recognised that Brexit was about democracy. It wasn't about any of the allegations that were levelled at it in terms of xenophobia or whatever. It was this really moment which felt like it could turn into something transformative, or at least would shift the dial in a more interesting direction. But as you say, less than 3 years later, we're here again. Another Tory Prime Minister felled. And to answer the question of why that happened, I think there's two things that are true at the same time here. One of which is, of course, there has been a concerted effort to delegitimise him and bring him down. That's been obvious since day one. The reason he's resigned is, of course, is not really about Chris Pincher. The fact that it's ended with this is kind of farcical. And of course, the media and the political class have leapt on every scandal going in order to paint this government as illegitimate, as unlike any government that ever was before it, as uniquely kind of craven and lying and deceitful and all the rest of it. And there's a lot of people very excited, feeling like they've succeeded in trying to essentially oust this government, which they don't like because of Brexit. But at the same time, the problem was that Johnson was increasingly incapable of defending himself.
Yeah.
His government became increasingly incoherent. To the extent that it had a programme, it was one that actually was against the interests of a lot of ordinary people who originally put him there. And as one scandal stacked on top of the other, with number 10 increasingly incapable of doing anything other than fanning the flames, it got to the point where it had nothing to talk about but scandal, and it also had nothing else to point to.
Yeah.
You got to a point where their voters were very demoralised. There was a poll before he finally stepped down talking that there was a majority of Tory voters were now suggesting he should resign. So much had he fucked it, basically. And I essentially think it's the coming together of those two things. Obviously, a very concerted effort from the media, from the political class to reassert itself, to get rid of what they see as this aberrant Prime Minister, only really because they dislike Brexit and populism so much, really. He's a kind of conduit for that. But at the same time, I think Boris Johnson has proven himself fundamentally incapable of fighting the fight that he essentially picked with the establishment when he embraced Brexit, when he insisted on implementing it, and when he got a majority, standing on the side of the people rather than the establishment. He failed to live up to that. He became mired in scandal, he became mired in his own kind of narrowed concerns, and ultimately this is where we've ended up. But there's no doubt that it leaves a bitter taste and a fear of what might come next, definitely.
And Brexit, obviously one of the positives of this government, no matter how imperfect. Do you think, Ella, that they kind of ran out of steam after Brexit? Tom is talking about this kind of drift that the government had. You could say it's even worse in some ways, embracing things like net zero or failing to fight the culture wars. I mean, what do you make of that?
It's never sat well with me, this idea that Boris is the hero of Brexit. I mean, there are lots of things that are true. He was in a kind of basically a shower of bastards who were trying to overturn democracy throughout almost the entirety of Westminster.
Yeah.
He stood out as being someone who whether opportunistically or not, who cares, did the right thing at the right time.
Said he was going to respect the people's wishes, which astonishingly was a rare thing.
And what a low bar.
Yeah.
But the test of the man comes after the win, and after 2019, the way in which he handled the pandemic, which we covered extensively on this podcast, the way in which he has talked about, even just sort of the way in which he's dealt with different policy areas, whether it's immigration or the withdrawal from Afghanistan, or, his obsession with, net zero and green stuff and just kind of virtue signaling via environmentalism, shows that he has fundamentally no understanding of the key thing of Brexit, which was about democracy and sovereignty and putting power back into the hands of the every man and woman. So, I think he just gets too much credit for it. We've forgotten, because we have had it dragged out of us for so many years, that Brexit was won by us, not him, and that it was only that he had to mop up the mistakes of other people who were trying to thwart it. So that kind of irks me. But there is also the case that, the thing about Boris Johnson is that whether it was, his wife, Carrie, whether it was Dominic Cummings, or, any of the others that he had in several aides, he always seemed to be a man who only did what the last person who whispered in his ear advised.
Yeah.
And actually, I think he's proven himself to be, he bowed under the pressure throughout the pandemic from, the media, from the sort of scientific advisors who are suggesting things that were wildly unfair, like locking people up and arresting people for the most minor things. He had none of that sort of infamous libertarian liberal spirit came through when it really mattered.
Yeah, I want to stick with the pandemic for a bit, because that is arguably the most significant aspect of his premiership. We forget that for months on end under Boris Johnson, we were locked in our houses. And, for 2 of the 3 years of his premiership, there was some kind of COVID regulation, some kind of criminal offence, for whether it's for not self-isolating at the very tail end of it, or, it's illegal to meet 2 people or to meet another person outdoors. What do you think that told us about Boris and his, was he always a phony libertarian? Was he, as Ella just suggests, he too easily gives in to his advisors or experts? What did you make of that?
I think it's a bit of all of that. I mean, who could, in a sense, it's impossible not to take into account the pandemic and all the rest of it. And also the fact that, lockdown, as punishing and liberal, as dreadful as it was also a product of kind of inter-elite groupthink. Like, they were all doing the same thing at the same time.
Every other country did it.
And it wasn't just a case of being pressured by your own advisors. It was also a case of being pressured by, again, the kind of entire international set. That's not to let him off the hook, but it provides a little bit of context, I guess. I mean, there's a lot of people who were accusing him as being a phony libertarian, this kind of Merry England libertarian who then, locks everyone in their houses and starts banging on about pudding taxes. I think I think more fundamentally the issue is that he was always a bit of a phony populist. He was quite opportunistic. He did seize on this. He did write those 2 editorials, one leave, one remain, and all the rest of it. But at the same time, and you can't help but be struck by the nature of the opposition to him within the Tory party itself. They have no idea what they're doing. Like, there's no factional basis to this. A lot of them are just moving as individuals. There's been people in the 2019 intake who frankly wouldn't be there without Boris Johnson and the campaign that he ran, who have been agitating for him to leave for ages. So clueless are they as to how these things particularly work. So interested are they only really in their own potential social media cred and anything else. And then on the other side, of course, you've got the arraying forces of anti-populism, who are genuinely seeing this as an opportunity to, as Lord Heseltine put it, first Boris, then Brexit. And by that, they also mean populism. So on the one hand, I think he has shown himself up to be a bit of a phony, but we're caught in this problem is that we've got phony populists and we've got anti-populists and not much in between. And working that out and trying to make sure that the people's desire for more democracy, which this government briefly embodied and embraced, doesn't get lost in that infighting to come, I guess.
And sticking with that kind of anti-populist point, I mean, one of the striking features of the past couple of years has been Boris derangement syndrome, I think you could call it, where, you hinted at this earlier, Tom, Boris is the most evil, worst prime minister ever, the biggest liar we've ever known in politics. And clearly, Brexit is behind that. But there's, what have you made of that? I mean, it's exposed his opponents as kind of as unhinged, even if he is incompetent.
Jonathan Frieden wrote an column in The Guardian today discussing Brexit, but he called him a populist, and you could hear the kind of hiss of the populist in his words. It's like he's a villain because he was in favour, or at least pretended to be in favour of Brexit, whatever. But there's been, if you look kind of back along the sort of scope of Boris Johnson's career, sort of after he became mayor, but while he was in the sort of wings to be a hopeful prime minister, there have been, various things that people have leapt on. So back at the time when there was that discussion about the letterbox comment, everyone was sort of saying this cannot be forgotten. It's horrendous. He's a bigot. He's an Islamophobe. And then it didn't really work. And so they move on to the next thing. Oh, actually, he's, this kind of, serial shagger. Who knows how many kids he has? He's a horrendous kind of womanizer. Okay, maybe he is. But, again, that didn't stick. And then it moves on and on and on. And I think Tom's really right that it pretty much feels like, with the context of the pandemic and all of that and the excuses taken into account, that, what has this Prime Minister's period in office been about? It's just been about scandal after scandal after scandal, and one that's to do with his own incompetence and his inability to rise above it and put forward some exciting policies. But it's also the case that his opponents, or even actually his people who are meant to be loyal to him in his own party, have sort of really done a disservice to politics, because they've turned it into this very apolitical thing of, they, on the one hand, they bemoan, the increase in the politics of personality. This is terrible. We're becoming more presidential and he's like Trump. But then at the same time, you think, well, all you go on about is the personality of Boris, is the fact that you don't like that he's kind of buffoonish and all these things. You're completely on side with him and his approach to the cost of living crisis. Even the opposition doesn't have any difference to say to him in relation to his approach to the pandemic. So you just don't like the guy. And that comes across to voters and people who voted for the Conservative Party and people who didn't. There's just a cheapening of politics. It's like, is this all that it's about? Brendan O'Neill in his column this week called the people who have, the people within the Conservative Party have brought the demise of Boris about pound shop Brutuses, which it really is. It's like, you pathetic people who stand for nothing other than your opposition to Boris.
Whenever we want to learn something new, we need to know the information we're getting is trustworthy. That's why Wondrium is my favourite educational platform. With audio and video courses, documentaries, tutorials, and more, the list of things you can learn on Wondrium is endless, and it's all delivered by experts you can trust. For instance, I recently watched the Wondrium series Liberty on Trial in America, Cases That Defined Freedom, which I highly recommend. Over 24 eye-opening episodes, law professor Douglas Linder takes you through 400 years of court battles that have defined and redefined what it means to be a free citizen in the US. It explores the key courtroom clashes over religious freedom in the 1600s, the rights of slaves in the 19th century, the 20th century battles for civil rights, and of course Roe versus Wade, which is now as relevant as ever. This Wondrium series is a must-watch. If you want to learn more about where our freedoms came from, Wondrium has so many brilliant programs to watch or listen to. After Liberty on Trial, why not check out their series on Magna Carta or the US Constitution? Wondrium really has every subject covered. All Wondrium's videos, series, and how-to guides are filled with vetted information presented by the brightest minds in their fields. Plus, the Wondrium app makes it so easy. Just pick a program and you can watch it or listen to it on any device, anytime, anywhere. Wondrium is my learning companion that's always available. I know you'll love Wondrium as much as I do, so what are you waiting for? Sign up today. Wondrium is offering Spiked podcast listeners a free trial plus 20% off the annual plan. To get this offer, you need to visit our special URL at wondrium.com/spiked. Again, that's wondrium.com/spiked. Tom, one of the things that Boris and his government promised us was it was going to launch a war on woke. How did that go? Did that war even take place?
Not particularly. And I think that's one of the things that it really is one of the missed opportunities of this particular period, which is to take the culture war seriously, to realise that it's not just something that's either a distraction, as some people on the identitarian left might say, or made up, and nor is it kind of silly, nor is it just a way to land blows against woke lefties and to take the piss out of them because they have such crazy views, own the libs, whatever. It's really quite serious. And Frank Fraser said this on Brendan's podcast this week. The thing about a culture war is it is a war. You have to fight it. Like, it's not just something that you can giggle at from the sidelines, which I think is probably the most you could say this government actually did. Now, there were some pointed interventions on some of the issues of the day. Obviously, there was recently talk of mandating, making sure single-sex toilets and all the rest of it. The government has been relatively brave on some of those kind of issues around gender ideology, but ultimately has fundamentally failed to slow the takeover, essentially, of all of these different institutions by this ideology. It was almost like the more the government would try to engage in some sort of like rhetoric around it, the more it would just almost inevitably, take one institution after the other. So I think that will go down as something that it's fundamentally failed to do. And there's a lack of recognition of how serious this stuff is, because it has a fundamental impact on how resources in society, how state services, how kids are educated. All of this stuff is really, really important. And yet on this, as on so many other issues, the government just seemed kind of limp, apologetic.
Yeah.
And that was always a bit of a problem with Boris Johnson. He wants everyone to love him. And the social set he comes from is fundamentally a kind of metropolitan liberal set, meaning that on these quite tense battles, he can at best triangulate. And whether it was on the culture war or Brexit or anything else, that was one thing he always struggled with, I think, was the fact that sometimes you do have to go to war. And he's the sort of person who, despite his Churchillian, affectations, is not prepared for that in many respects, particularly on the domestic scene.
So I think it's fair to say that he failed to fight the war on woke. But in terms of the other great or bad regressive ideology of our age, Greenism, Johnson was a bit of a zealot, short of gluing his face to a train or something like that. He was the big champion of green, which is
incredible. It shows the superficiality of his politics, because he is. I bet if you got left in waiting for a train with him for 5 hours and actually managed to find out something about the man, you'd know that he doesn't really believe in the idea of net zero, and that he's not up for composting everything and being, he's not about to join Extinction Rebellion himself. He very, astutely understood that as a Tory, there needed to be something nice about him. And the nice thing about him, with being a London mayor and all that kind of stuff, was that he liked green stuff. He liked environmentalism. And the whole...
Didn't work though, did it?
No, it didn't work.
Ingratiating him.
No. But it was this idea that, that it kind of fundamentally shows the problem with his understanding of democracy, because the idea that you could be pushing for net zero and the kind of punitive green measures that the government is still pushing for at a time when you're also opining from, the dispatch box about how terrible it is that people can't afford to heat their homes and that kind of thing, means that he just cannot get into the mind of the voter. He has no interest actually in looking and understanding about what matters for people, about being in control of politics.
I think he was sort of looking for a program, though. And I think this was one of the things that sort of took place, where it was like, again, kind of after the 2019 election, which did create a certain level of like populist momentum. They were talking about all this democratic reform. They were constantly invoking FDR. Do you remember this in the kind of early days? There was this discussion. Levelling up was kind of cast in that particular
It would be Johnson's New Deal, essentially.
Exactly, all this sort of stuff. And a recognition that Brexit wasn't just about the European Union, although of course it was. It was also about people wanting politics to respond to their needs, to actually listen to them, all the rest of it. But it was just striking how he naturally kind of bobbed back towards these establishment orthodoxies. He almost couldn't help it. It was like the kind of gravitational pull of that. And that was one of the things that undid him, I think, was because to the extent that he had a program, it was increasingly quite incoherent. He wanted to level up the country whilst levelling it down via net zero.
Yeah.
And also, as you gestured to, it's not even clear that he's really firm in these convictions at all. He just wanted something to sell himself with, and this is the thing that bizarrely sort of landed upon, I guess.
It's similar to the whole thing of the failures of the fight against wokeism, which is that, as we've explained till we're blue in the face, the reason why you disagree with all this wokery stuff is not just because it's ridiculous, but it's because you have a fundamental principle belief in freedom, and freedom of speech, freedom of expression, people's ability to associate with each other and talk with each other freely. In relation to attacks on freedom of speech in the Police and Crime Courts Bill, Priti Patel just being allowed to run riot with censorship wherever she wants, online safety bill, all of these, the government pretty much is characterised at the moment by left, right and centre attacking freedom of protest, freedom of speech in all its forms. And so that means that the kind of the war on woke or any kind of populist angle they might have had there, because that is popular with people, because people don't think that being sort of Black Lives Matter and white privilege and, trans activism, all that stuff is interesting, that they failed to connect with that, because you have to have a principled belief in freedom. And again, because even though he blusters about being a libertarian and he's called a populist and all this kind of stuff, he doesn't and his government doesn't. And most important for us now, certainly none of the people that are coming looking for his crown have even less of a concept of freedom.
There's so much. I mean, you were talking earlier, Fraser, about the Boris derangement syndrome, the accusation of lying and all the rest of it, as if Boris Johnson invented lying in 2016 and that politicians had only ever been completely upstanding where the truth and statistics or anything else was ever there, that there'd never been a sex scandal in Westminster before Boris Johnson came along. The fact that Alistair Campbell became a national almost correspondent on the subject of truth and standards in public life.
He was on Question Time last night, just sounding off about it.
And got his ass handed to him by Tim Stanley at one moment, which was quite good. It's the shine's starting to come off, maybe because he's no longer needed. But the cynicism of it was absolutely stunning. And especially coming from the kind of old Blairite blob, which is responsible. If you want to talk about degradation of trust in politics, you want to talk about lying and bullshitting. If you want to talk about, again, barbarous foreign wars, let's again, it's absurd that we're getting to that point. But in many respects, at the same time, I think part of the problem with this government is that in the end, it became too much like its predecessors.
Yeah.
It had no point to it beyond its own survival, didn't really know what it was for other than the pursuit of power. Boris Johnson in the final few days kind of clinging on, saying he had to deliver for his voters despite not really being clear what it was he was trying to deliver and to whom. Again, I think that was the issue here, and was maybe always there, but nevertheless became starkly clear in the final few days, was that despite all this talk about this government being so aberrant, so unlike anything we've ever seen, proto-fascistic, all the rest of it, it was far too like its predecessors insofar as being kind of at drift and idea light and not really sure what it's there for other than to be in government.
And let's finally talk about the future. I mean, clearly Boris and his government ran out of steam, was unable to capitalise essentially on the populist energy that brought it to power. But, can we be optimistic about the future, Tom?
I think we've got to recognise that this will be taken as a big boon to basically the forces of anti-democracy, the technocrats, the people who want to reverse the gains of the post-2016 era. We shouldn't beat around the bush about that. They're all celebrating this week. They all spy on opportunity to basically reverse all of that. And the fundamental problem is that, again, there's no obvious kind of contender for someone to kind of pick up that energy that previously existed, kind of to reverse the demoralisation as well of kind of recent months and years as this government has started to take hits and start to crumble. And all of that is going to be very, very serious. At the same time, I think both sort of die-hard Boris fans as well as the Ramonas, if you like, make the same mistake, is that they kind of personalise this particular issue. This idea that you get rid of Boris and then suddenly all of these voters are going to think, you know what, we were wrong to think that we should get out of the European Union. We were wrong to think that we should matter more in politics. We were wrong to think that politics should be about us rather than the SW1 circus or whatever. It's ridiculous. And even if they might mount some kind of short-term gains, might be able to kind of claw back more influence and prominence and power than they had previously. I think the story that we've seen in America, that we're seeing in the Netherlands at the moment or wherever, is that even in France, which again was, Macron hailed as the person who defeated populism, this isn't going away, and it will take different forms because the fundamentals haven't changed. People want more democracy. People want their, values to be reflected in public life. They don't want to be scorned. They don't want to be condescended to, and they're not just going to pack up and go home. The difficulty is now again reversing that demoralisation, which has undoubtedly taken place as a result of not just this week, but previously as well.
And Ella, what's your thoughts?
Well, at the moment I'm incredibly jaded because I think Brendan really hit the nail on the head when he said that the nature of this demise of Boris is inherently apolitical. It really is. There is no ideology behind it. In fact, actually, he even says, if this were a kind of hard, intense Heseltine style Remainer pushback, at least you'd have something to kind of put your finger on. But it really is just a circus of personalities. And I think it's going to sound to voters and look to voters like a real insult. There are not to kind of keep banging the drum about the cost of living crisis, but there are very serious challenges facing this country. And we're now going to have, Boris Johnson said to Tory party politicians, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything for the next few months. There'll be no radical policy changes. I'm just, don't worry about it. And you think, well, Christ, if there was ever a time we needed some radical policy changes, it would be now. This isn't the time to piss away 3 months. But, the important thing, I think, for voters to recognise is that if Boris had stayed, nothing would change. Now that he's left, nothing is going to change necessarily. Even if there was a snap election, and which actually I'm increasingly more interested in, because I just feel that the nature of a Tory leader being voted in by a sort of puff of smoke is not legitimate. But actually nothing would change. And I think it's time to maybe throw back and encourage the idea of throwing back the power to the voters, to some of us who are so demoralized post 2016, to kind of shake ourselves up a little bit and say, actually, if we just carry on letting this circus continue, nothing will change for us, and all we'll be able to do is moan. I don't know what shape that will take, but trying to reinvigorate that sense of democratic opportunity that has come from 2016, that waned but was still there in 2019. I think that's the most centrally important thing, and remembering that politicians might be in Westminster and they might run the country in terms of, technically, but it's actually us who are supposed to run them. We should start flexing our muscles a little.
Tom, let's talk just finally about 2019. This election changed Britain forever, surely. That's, even if Boris has kind of squandered its opportunities, there was something there that could be recaptured.
I think so. I think it's easy to forget how important and how seismic that was. Second only really to 2016, insofar as just the public impressing themselves on the political stage and saying we have to be listened to. You remember the way in which that election saved Brexit from the clutches of the Remainer Parliament, closed the issue, and also the fact that to a certain extent it has forced the political class to respond.
Yeah,
I mean, it was fascinating to see, as we were talking a bit about earlier, Boris Johnson portray his government as the people's government, to put all of these democratic reforms front and centre. The levelling up agenda, yes, it hasn't really come to anything whatsoever, but that was obviously a recognition of what had fundamentally changed. This week, we had Keir Starmer pretending to be okay with Brexit. There's no one who could win an election, it seems to me, or certainly not a Tory leadership election, on a platform to, again, undo Brexit. Now, should we trust any of these people as far as we can throw them, particularly those who spent so long trying to overturn Brexit? Of course not. But it shows how powerful those two votes put together was, particularly working class voters across Britain being ignored for so long, particularly taken for granted by the Labour Party. Through 2016 and then 2019, they made themselves matter. They put themselves on the electoral map. And for all things that have been squandered over recent years, in terms of delivering that, in terms of actually getting Brexit through, even in imperfect form, Boris Johnson, that election rightly takes its place, I think, in the history of kind of the battle for democracy in Britain, essentially. He's proven himself to be a deeply inadequate vessel for turning that into something more durable, something for the long term, and all the rest of it. And there are potentially setbacks to come, but there's so much there to be recaptured.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.